All right. Today we really have a treat, an old alumni of the Bureau. Robert Baumgardner is here. He's going to talk about a 2-year research project to try to find more information about not only his family and what they did in World War II, but also the mystery of who this boy is riding a bike on the dike. Who is this person? Can they find him? All this stuff. So it's going to be really great. It's really fun. Thank you all for coming. Let's enjoy it. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Raj. Thank you for being here. Thank you, all of you people out there in Zoom land. So let's get started. This is a story about my search for a man on a bike on a dike. But before I talk about the man on the bike on the dike, I have to give you some background on my family. This is my grandparents, Joe and Eva Baumgardner, with their 8 children. This picture was taken in the summer of 1941. The summer my dad went off to college to join his brothers at Texas Tech, and the summer before the United States entered World War II. These are the future bomber pilots: my dad, Robert, my Uncle Haynes, and Uncle John Henry. Forrest, the brother in the middle there, the tallest one, was not in the service because he was working in a vital industry at a dairy. And when his daughter, my cousin Eva, asked her mother why her daddy wasn't in the war, she said, because somebody has to make the ice cream for the children. And that was vital enough for Eva, so she was satisfied with that answer. Okay, back to the bomber pilots. In 1944, when this story takes place, my Uncle John Henry was 28, my Uncle Haynes was 24, and my dad was 21. Haynes and John Henry served in Europe in the 8th Air Force, and my dad was in the 5th Air Force in the Pacific. The man on the bike on the dike story is related to my Uncle Haynes's experience. And they heard the story only one time at his 80th birthday party in July 2000. This is a picture of the siblings that were there: my dad, Robert, Uncle Haynes, their siblings, and spouses. And that was the first time I remember ever seeing Uncle Haynes's scrapbook that he got out and started showing to us. So this was a rare occasion. Neither my uncle nor my dad ever talked about their experience in World War II unless you asked them directly about it. So this was a rare experience. Uncle Haynes started leafing through his scrapbook as we looked over his shoulder, and he was telling stories, and he landed on this page, his 25th mission, and said that he thought this was probably the most interesting one that he flew. This was the second day of Operation Market Garden, also known as the Battle of Arnhem, depicted in the 1977 film A Bridge Too Far, which, if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. It's got Robert Redford in it, so that should be enough for anybody, right? So here are a few facts, and I'm not going to get into too many military minutiae here, but Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation in history, bigger than D-Day. 34,000 Allied troops landed behind German lines in the Netherlands, and it began September the 17th, a Sunday, about 3 months after D-Day. So back to the scrapbook. This is the second day of Operation Market Garden, and I've transcribed my uncle's handwritten notes from his scrapbook. The target was Best Holland. The purpose was to drop supplies to troops. They flew in at about 250 feet, used 2,300 gallons of fuel. Flight took 5 hours and 10 minutes. And we'll get to the next line, this one, returned through Holland at treetop level and below. So remember that. I want to introduce the crew. This was the crew on that day. The tail gunner and the navigator did not participate because they weren't needed. They were following the planes in the line in front of them, so they didn't need a navigator, and they're flying so close to the ground, they didn't need a tail gunner. The people ranged in age from 19. Dale Heckler, the nose gunner, was 19. The oldest guy in the crew was 29. And they called him the old man. Edward Sanders was 29 and the old man. Yes, please. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yes, I have. That generation looked much older at a younger age than we did, in my opinion. Yeah, very mature for their age. And so for those of you who are not obsessed with the aircraft of World War II, I'm going to tell you about a B-24 bomber. This is what a B-24 looks like. The crew positions were the bombardier, nose gunner, pilot in the left seat, co-pilot in the right seat, radio operator behind them, engineer and top turret gunner behind the radio operator, right waist gunner on the right, left waist gunner on the left, but you can't see him. Notice that there's no ball turret. Instead, for this mission, the ball turret had been removed, so there was a hole in the floor through which they could push the supply bundles when they reached the drop zone. Another important thing to notice is how high on the wing the engines, how high on the fuselage the wing was, and there's all this space between the engines and the ground. So one could literally scrape the ground with the belly of the plane without the props hitting the ground. So to understand my uncle's frame of mind when he flew into Holland that day at 250 feet, it's necessary to reflect back on the last time he flew into Holland, which is 24 days before, and they'd flown over Rotterdam at a height of 20,000 feet. And as they were flying in formation over Rotterdam, Uncle Haynes heard a thump and felt a thump, and he called back to the tail gunner, whose name was Knapp, and said, "Knapp, did you see anything?" And Knapp said, "No, sir, I didn't see anything." Nevertheless, Haynes slid the plane over just enough to the right to stay in formation and not hit the plane to his right. And the next explosion was at his eye level, where the plane would have been if he hadn't moved. And they'd flown over flak barges, which were manned by Germans shooting the 88mm anti-aircraft weapon, which is the deadliest aircraft weapon of the war. It could fire anywhere from vertical to below horizontal. In fact, it was an effective anti-tank gun used by the Germans. And so Uncle Haynes knew, as he was flying back into the Netherlands 24 days later, that the risk he was taking was quite high. So back to the scrapbook. As we're sitting there looking through these pictures, they're arranged in more or less random order. And you can see here planes approaching the drop zone. And you can probably see a parachute right there just beginning to open. Here they are closer to the drop zone, and you can see parachutes already on the ground. Another shot over a drop zone. And here's a shot taken somewhere else, but you can see the tail, part of the tail showing up in the photograph. So I assumed somebody was standing in the waist position of my uncle's plane, just taking snaps out the window. Here's another page. Here's a port, something burning, probably a ship. Another shot over the drop zone. Here's a crashed C-47. Here's another crashed C-47 in a lake. Here's a canal, and here's a town with an S-shaped street, which we'll see again later on. This is just past the drop zone. More shots of the drop zone, plane directly over the drop zone with a bullet hole in the tail. And this photograph, perhaps the most chilling one of all, of a B-24 just as it crashes, with the right wing kicking up dust just as it hits the ground. And this is the note that Uncle Haynes wrote about that. Captain Hunter went down, operations officer, Captain Mitchell as command pilot. Very straightforward, no emotion, what you'd expect from somebody who was, in his situation, facing death almost on a daily basis. And this is what happened next. When we dropped our supplies to turn left and climb out, I saw our group leader, Captain James K. Hunter, crash as the right wingtip hit the ground. The deputy leader stayed low when we returned to the English Channel of the North Sea at treetop level or below. I flew below Dike level at times, just climbed a little to clear and right back down. Never forget bicyclists crossing the dike in front of us who saw us at the last minute and threw himself to the ground. And that's the man on the bike on the dike. And that's all I knew for 17 years until I retired in October 2017. And I knew what my next full-time job was going to be. So I started contacting every World War II related museum in the Netherlands to see if they had any sort of record by anybody of this bizarre incident. And I started in alphabetical order with the Airborne Museum right outside of Arnhem. Went down the list. I sent them a brief paragraph translated into Dutch by Steve Ruppel's wife, saying, just in a nutshell, this is what happened on September the 18th. Have you ever heard of this incident? Any record? And this is a sample of the response. In the Netherlands, we have not one dike, but more than hundreds. It is really impossible to check. As you probably know, Holland is littered with dikes, so it is impossible to answer your question. Unfortunately, I feel that the chances of finding out who was riding the bike are practically non-existent. The chances of finding this particular person or his relatives are practically zero. And on and on and on. I heard this needle in a haystack more times than I care to remember. Until I got to the Wings of Liberation Museum. And as you'll know, in alphabetical order, that's almost at the bottom. And Ernst Voss, my co-author on this talk, emailed back and said, if the place and exact time of flying over the dike is known, we can do some research. Very precise in his language. And this is Ernst on the right. And if you ask me, he looks like somebody who knows his stuff. And he does. He is a walking encyclopedia of Operation Market Garden lore. So the drop zone and the museum where he works is about 1 kilometer from the drop zone. So all things considered, I knew Ernst was the guy. So he started on his end and I started on my end. I got the after action report for that mission and a copy of the Ringmasters, the history of the 491st Bomb Group, which we can take a look at later. And started trying to put together all I could figure out about that particular mission. And I found the mission formation diagram. You'll see that my uncle's plane is way over here on the right. And it was echeloned off to the right of A flight. Hunter was flying the lead plane and Boyd was the deputy leader. Note that this is not the scale. And then I found in the after action report a page that listed which planes were carrying cameras. Not my uncle's plane. There was a plane to his left and there was a plane behind him. So he sort of bracketed in between these photographs in his scrapbook. This is what the camera looked like. Weighed 11 pounds. It was solid metal because it had to be able to withstand the force of a 160-mile-an-hour wind coming by the plane, because it was held either handheld, pointed out the window, or mounted on a bracket in the waist gunner position on the side of the plane, something like this. So I went back to the photographs in my uncle's scrapbook, which my cousin was scanning and putting online, and tried to fit them into what looked like chronological order to me as near as I could tell. So this is on the way to the drop zone. And I didn't know where this town was. And when I gave this talk in the Netherlands in 2019, I said, if anybody knows where this is, please tell me. And this guy in the second row raised his hand. He said, do you see that little dome right there? I said, oh yeah, okay. He said, that's the prison in Breda. I used to work there. So, okay, it's Breda. We're going to hear about Breda again. And the next thing that happened as they were proceeding inland, my uncle had this experience. This is from a letter that he wrote to the family much later on. We were at some 250 feet directly above the town. I was bordering the south side of the main east-west street. I had noticed the machine gun nest at the intersection of this street and the north-south main street firing at the bombers. Just east of the machine gun nest, in other words, behind the machine gun nest, ladies were lined up on their second-story verandas waving flags at him. Soon after passing the intersection, those blasted gunners, same as the flak barge gunner, so it was in the back of his mind, had our number, and traces were flying by my window close enough to reach out and touch. I actually hit the #2 engine, which was right outside his window. Here we are at the western edge of the drop zone. You can see a parachute there just beginning to deploy. Here we are over the drop zone, and these have opened up. Here's that bullet hole, a recent acquisition, I believe. And then here's that curving street in that town just beyond the drop zone. I later figured out that this is Nieuwstraat or New Street in the town of Sonnenbrugge. These are American Jeeps heading south towards the Wilhelmina Canal. And here's a parachute bundle coming down that was dropped by the flight of planes just in front of this plane. And if you zoom in on this square right here and blow it up, you can see three girls in dark skirts and white blouses looking up to the right. So I think they're watching that parachute bundle come down. Here are two Jeeps heading to the canal, three soldiers. These people are standing on the sidewalk, also look like they're watching the parachute bundle. Here are three people on bicycles. Here's a woman, I think she's pushing a baby carriage because you can see the shadow of the wheel right here. So these people are obviously just caught in the middle of their everyday life, walking down the street, and they're about to be involved in one of the greatest battles of World War II. So they turn left, the squadron heads out. Their orders are go up to altitude 1,000 feet so that they're out of the way of the incoming planes. So Captain Hunter's in the front, he goes up first, gets hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashes, slides across this field, slams into these trees over here, and burns down the farmhouse at the Van Yersel farm. Here's the missing aircrew report for that mission. Every crashed American plane has a missing aircrew report that is on file at the National Archives. So you can look it up and find the information you need to pinpoint where it crashed, at least as close as they knew at the time. So I transcribed this so you can read it. The important information is right here. 18th of September, 1944, 1635. That's the time on the plane. That's the time at the base. That's not the time in the Netherlands. The Netherlands was an hour ahead. And here's the location of the crash as near as they knew from the report of the eyewitnesses who saw it. The Germans also kept pretty good records, as I'm sure you've heard. This is the sketch map from the anti-aircraft battery that shot down the plane. And I've had this redone, and Jana Robinson up in cartography did this for me. Did a fantastic job. So here's the flight of the B-24 coming in. It was engaged from this point to this point, swerved to the right, and crashed near the town of Winkel. The aircraft battery, anti-aircraft battery, fired 42 rounds of 3.7 millimeter ammunition. So they were keeping track at this point in the war. They were keeping track of everything they fired because they were running out. And you'll note here, if you've looked ahead, this date is wrong. That's because this map was misplaced and put in with the report for a C-47 that was shot down 2 days later. But I know this map is correct because it coincides with the actual crash, and it also coincides with the written record, which I'll show again in a minute. So here's the actual crash site, and there's where the Germans say it crashed. So it's within a couple of 100 yards of the actual crash site. And this is the report from the German archives. On 9/1844, formations of aircraft entered the airspace south of Hertogenbosch. As they returned, a helicopter, Liberator, flying at an altitude of 300 meters, offered an excellent opportunity for the 3.7 centimeter platoon of the battery to shoot. Guns fired and immediately hit the target and began billowing smoke. Spurts of flame were seen coming out of the engines. Quickly lost altitude, curved north, crashed in flames. Since the 3.7 platoon of the 6th FFAS-30 effectively engaged the target with 42 rounds, thus causing it to crash, the detachment requests recognition of the kill. So we know exactly where the plane crashed. And now we know where to start looking to start the route of the plane out of the Netherlands. So if you look in the navigator's report from the after action report, at least lists the important information of time and position in at the enemy coast, position out at the enemy coast. And the reason the position in at the enemy coast is important is because eyewitnesses from the ringmaster's history said that they flew out the same point they flew in. So although we don't have information directly from my uncle's plane, we do have information from the planes in his squadron. And we know that they were flying out in formation because that's the way they were trained the day before. So the void entry point is here. Here's the drop zone over here. We know they were trying to avoid these anti-aircraft batteries marked by the double A's here. So that's the route in. And I mentioned having the eyewitness information from the ringmaster's report. Here's the Hunter crash point. We know they're avoiding these anti-aircraft batteries, and here's the point out. So somewhere along that line is the man on the bike on the Dike. So at the suggestion of one of my correspondents in the Netherlands, I contacted every local historical society that I could find in that route. And there were several of them. Every one of these white dots represents a town that has a historical society. But as you might imagine, in a country that's been around for as long as the Netherlands has, they're interested in maybe 1849 or 1749. 1949 is, that's yesterday, or 1944, I should say. So when I asked them with the same letter that I'd sent to the museums, anybody you know ever heard this story? Anybody in your membership ever heard this story? Mostly what I got back was, and here's an example of one of the historical society's web pages. Mostly what I got back was more comments about a haystack. They were friendly and they were interested, but they didn't have a lot to share. So the more I looked, the more complicated it got, because the Germans had confiscated the bicycles of the Netherlands. And so this could have been a German soldier. Unlikely that a German soldier was out riding his bike during the middle of the liberation of the Netherlands, but that was another possibility. And a lot of the Dutch had immigrated after the war, so I contacted every Dutch expat organization I could find, because they'd gone 94,000 to Canada, tens of thousands to the US, and even more to Australia. So the man on the bike on the Dike could have been anywhere on the planet. But 15 months went by, no man on the bike. And I knew at this point that using the internet was going to give me limited results, because anybody older than me has a very slim chance that they're going to be using the internet. Excuse me. Okay, so how do you use the internet to find somebody who's not on the internet? Well, I had what I thought was a stroke of genius. I'll put a personal ad in the newspaper that covers that area. So here's the ad here under the title General, between festivals, events, and private and erotic. Exactly. So here's what it says. Looking for a man on a bike on a Dike. Last seen September 1944 between Tilburg and the sea, nearly killed by the propellers of the B-24 bomber flown by my uncle. Contact me. And since you're paying by the word, I had to keep it succinct. Well, I got about as much response. I don't know about Kim down here, but I got zero response to this ad. So I had another idea, which was to have somebody put together a flyer for me, translate it into Dutch, take it with me to the Netherlands, because we were going to go to the 75-year commemoration of Operation Market Garden in September of 2019. And I figure if anybody knows anything about this guy, it's going to be somebody who knows about, or is interested in, or has heard stories about Operation Market Garden. So I had 500 of these flyers printed up in Dutch and another 100 printed up in English. And I started sending the Dutch versions 10 at a time to my correspondents. But then to hand out at retirement homes or churches or community centers or bars. Who knows where this story, which I assumed had been told wide and far, because If this happened to you, wouldn't you tell everybody you knew? I thought man on the bike would have. At least to his priest to thank him. Please pray for me. Thank God for my survival. Okay, here's the flip side. And there are copies up here that y'all can take with you after we get done. It is the English version. In the meantime, I sent a digital version to Hank Den Ritter, who was a journalist at that same newspaper where I placed the personal ads that didn't work. And Hank asked me for more information, and he ran a story in the print version of the newspaper on the 13th of May, which was a Monday in 2019, titled "The Search Continues. Who was that cyclist on the bike?" And it went through the mail slot of this house at number 4 Newkirk Street in Zevenbergen, and into the hands of a 97-year-old woman who had subscribed to the paper for 64 years. And she read the story 3 times and turned to her son Henry and said, "Henry, this is my father." And that's the first time Henry had ever heard about the encounter between his grandfather and the plane. So Henry, who does use the internet, emailed Hank and said, "Hank, this is my grandfather." And Hank went over and interviewed them 2 days later, took a photographer, took this picture. And Hank, the journalist, had lived next door to the family for 25 years, and he had never heard the story. So this is the story of the man on the bike on the Dike. Johanna and Geert Kleenen are pictured here at their 25-year wedding anniversary in June 1941, the same time that my family had their portrait taken, as you recall from the very first slide at the beginning of the talk. That Sunday, September the 17th, as was their habit, most of the family got up and went to church at St. Bartholomew Church in Zevenbergen. When they got there, the priest warned all of the men to go into hiding because the Germans were rounding up every able-bodied man and pressing them into work gangs to dig ditches because they knew the Americans would come. Well, the Allies. We can't take all the credit. The Allies were coming. But Jo and Geert did not go to Mass that morning because their 17-year-old son, Jan, had wakened up paralyzed. He had complained of headaches all summer long, and his mother just assumed that it was his smoking habits and his bad eating habits, and he just wasn't taking care of himself. But this obviously was serious. So they called the doctor. The doctor came and examined him. They said, "Gotta get him to the hospital." So they put him on a stretcher because they couldn't get the ambulance up to the house because the Germans had blocked the road. Carried the stretcher to the ambulance, drove the ambulance down to Breda. Remember Breda with the prison? And took him to the deaconess's house hospital in Breda. And so here's the steeple of that church, St. Bartholomew's Church. This is Sunday afternoon with C-47s going over to drop paratroopers at the drop zone that my uncle's going to fly to tomorrow. So the Dutch knew liberation was at hand. And on Monday, Geert got up and got on his bicycle and pedaled down to Breda to see Jan in the hospital, hid his bike at the Steamboat Cafe, walked over to the hospital, walked back to the cafe, got back on his bike and headed home. Now, this is a reenactor depicting what it might have looked like at the time. What you should know, which it doesn't show here, is that at that point in the war, there were no bicycle tires. So they used recycled car tires they cut into strips. So they couldn't go flat, but it was kind of a bumpy ride, as you might imagine. So Geert is pedaling up this road right here, and he comes to the Mark River and the bridge over the Mark River at Zwartenberg. And as he's going up the ramp, up to the bridge, these trees were not here in 1944. Goes up the ramp, he hears this terrible roar coming at him from the right, and looks over and sees something like this. Threw himself on the ground, the plane goes over, he gets back on his bike and pedals home to the family home at quick, Dike. Can you translate that for us? Quick, Dike. Right? Okay. Okay. If you use Google Translate, it says cuckoo Dike. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, he rushes into the house and says, I was almost killed. He tells the story of the bomber flying over him. And Adriana, the woman, 97-year-old woman in 2019, is depicted here in the middle. Remember that for the rest of her life. Here's Geert on the left and Yo on the right and Adriana in the middle. So over the next few days or weeks, Geert goes on his bicycle down to see Jan almost on a daily basis. And every once in a while, Adriana goes too, but there's only one bicycle in the family, so only one person can go. And besides which, they have to hide the bike, keep the Germans finding it and taking it away. At some point, the Spartanburg Bridge was destroyed and it was too dangerous to go. And the whole area is being fought over between the Allies and the Germans. So we can't get to Breda anymore. In fact, at one point, almost the entire village sheltered in the basement of the church for 9 days straight. There were over 2,000 people in the basement. And the Germans at one point dynamited the bell tower because it was being used as a aiming point by the Allied artillery. And it almost fell through the floor and crushed the people in the basement. Luckily, that didn't happen. While they were down there, there was no sewage, no light. The only food they had was the bread that the bakers went out and baked at night in the bakeries and sneaked back in before the sun came up. They actually, a doctor there did surgery, removing wounded limbs using the sacramental wine as anesthetic. So it was a rough 9 days. Finally, the Germans were pushed back. They retreated back east. And Siebenbergen was liberated. So Geert gets back on his bicycle, goes down to Breda, only to find that Jan had died on November the 22nd of an inoperable brain tumor. And the story was never mentioned again. Jan's death wasn't talked about because he died by himself, alone in the hospital in Breda. Geert was the only one who could go to the funeral. He was buried there in the cemetery in Breda. They did have a memorial service for him at the church in Siebenbergen, but it was a heartache for his mother the rest of her life, and it was never mentioned again. And likely for that reason, the story of the man on the bike on the dike, because it was associated with Jan's untimely, lonely death, never mentioned again. Geert continued to work in a sugar factory there in Siebenbergen, where he had started when he was 12 years old. And in 1966, the family got together. Their 8 surviving children and siblings and grandchildren got together for another family portrait. Here's Geert and Yo in the middle. Here's Tante Ad or Adriana, her husband Jan, and here's Henry, her son, at age 6. Geert and Yo lived until 1977 and 79 respectively, and they're buried in the cemetery in Siebenberg. My uncle, about the same time, was starting his family. He had 2 sons, Haynes Jr. and Jan, who's also, like me, born in October 1950, and wife Myrna. Haynes went ahead and had a 30-year career in the Air Force, served in Japan and South Korea and stateside, and retired in 1972. And he retired to San Antonio. We would go down there and celebrate his birthday with him, most of the extended family, every year in the summertime. Just so you know, we did not coordinate our outfits. That was completely random. And then in August 2017, he died. and recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. And he never knew I found the man on the bike on the dike. So I would like to close with this quote from my email pal, Henry. The story of the man on the bike shows that everybody matters. So I can take some questions, or I've got another little anecdote I can tell you. It'll take about 5 minutes. Do you want to defer the questions? Or okay. All right. Quote from P.J. O'Rourke. Just because the subject is serious doesn't mean it doesn't have plenty of absurdities. Well, we've already seen one absurdity. Here's another one. At 24 years old, my uncle was in Europe flying death-defying missions almost every day. Because he said, took a poll of the crew and they said, let's fly every mission we can as soon as we can and get out of here. So
I'm sorry, but we just lost. I'm sorry, we just lost the sound on Zoom. There we go.
here's my dad at 21. At the time, he was undergoing pilot training at Liberal Airfield in Liberal, Kansas. And I think you know where I'm going with this story. Because it's only about 160 miles from the family farm up in the Panhandle in Collingsworth County. So here's my dad's pilot log from, note the date, September the 13th. That's 5 days before my uncle's mission. Flying from Liberal to Local, solo, day, night. And here's a letter to my dad from his mother. They were faithful correspondents throughout the war. Our dear, again, I waved and wept when we all watched that little boy of mine fly over home this morning, just as I waved and wept when I saw 2 other of our little boys that go over. So clearly this was a family tradition at this point. His 2 older brothers had done the same thing. Hope you saw David south of the house grazing lambs. He saw you coming and gave that huge whistle of his so excitedly that I ran out and gave my war whoop. I'll let you read the rest of it. Here's my grandmother at her writing desk. Here's a letter back from my dad to his mom. When I came over the other day, I saw David south of the house. He was running toward the house and waving. Last time I came over, just before the nose hid you. So apparently this is the second time that letter is lost. Last time I came over, just before the nose hid you, I saw Daddy take off his hat and wave. If I ever get down again, I'll let the other fellow fly and I'll look. You notice this is September the 16th, 2 days before my own. Okay. September the 19th, Liberal to Local, solo day. Another letter from my dad to his mom. My dad from his mom. Yes, we were all thrilled this morning. We heard that low roar over the barn. I was milking Armistice. Was there ever a cow more appropriately named during wartime? David got on the barn. I'm sure you didn't miss them. And then a letter the next day. Donetta, Howard, and several others came over last eve. She said, tell you not to come over so early anymore because you wake her up. Here's the barn climbing David. And there's the barn. And here's the letter back from my dad to his mother. Enjoyed your letter today. I'm glad that I saw the plane. Tell her when you see her that I buzzed the town just for her benefit. And note the date, 22nd September. On the same day, my uncle wrote a letter to his younger brother, my dad. And you can just smell the youthful enthusiasm as you read this. You should have been on our last mission with me. You know, we've always been at around 20 to 27,000 feet, down to 12,000. Well, after my last letter, you can put it down to 5 feet. Pulled up to around 300 feet of the target, back down to as low as possible. I went over one town between two church steeples, which were far above me. We caught lots of machine guns plus 20 millimeter. The boys up at 300 feet on up caught flak. Unlucky for them too. Everyone waved to beat the band. We'd come over, they'd dive for ditches behind dikes. Very thrilling throughout. So PJ O'Rourke was absolutely right about that. Okay. Any questions? I've got a 3-minute video I can show you if you've got the stomach for it. Okay, how do I get to the other screen? Sorry? That's outside of Wellington, Texas, in Collingsworth County. That's right. Okay. How do I play this? Hit the arrow? Okay.
The next day, at our home, number 4 in the Kirk slot and Zealand we met on a hill. Don't you all slow down. There's something to read. Story. Yeah.
Sorry? Yes. I took piano lessons when I was a kid. Yes. I'm actually working on a graphic novel. I found an illustrator who is willing to take this on, and she lives in California. So she and I are emailing back and forth. putting it together. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Shirley. John Wilson. He's an illustrator here in town. Yep. Yeah, he did a great job. That is what made the story happen, because none of my attempts to garner attention did anything until people saw the graphic. And that's what made Hank put it in the newspaper, because he had this great illustration that would get people to read the story.
I'm still a little, we're still a little upset at what the Germans did to the bikes back in World War II, because it was only about 15 years ago there was a European soccer qualifying match in the Netherlands, and
Right.
the Germans had to drive in.
Yeah.
And the Dutch were not above putting these massive placards across the flyovers on the highway. And one of them, big banner said,
Where's my bike?
give us our bicycles back.
Yeah, what, adding to that, one of my correspondents, Eric Holtgrief, did a great job for me. Said that his dad's bike was confiscated and taken back to Germany. And in about 2013, his dad got a check from Volkswagen for 12 euros. And a note attached saying, your bicycle was melted down in 1953 and used for hubcaps. Here's your check. Yeah, so he says that people still yell at the Germans when they see German bicycling tours coming through the Netherlands. Where's my bike? Indeed. Well, thank you very much for your attention and your interest. And I've got the ringmaster's history if you want to take a look at that, and copies of the brochure if you want to take one with you. There's
Do we have any questions on chat right now? Looks like
Yeah.
we
We just have some thank yous and people congratulating Robert on an amazing story and a remarkable search, and congratulating your persistence.
thank you.
It was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. We had 28 people watching virtually too, so
Great. Thank you.
wonderful.
Out.